The morning Edwin Dalton noticed smoke rising from the old Mercer cabin down the creek. He stood on his porch for a long time without moving, one hand resting on the wooden rail he had carved himself 3 years prior, and he felt something shift inside his chest that he could not immediately name. It was the autumn of 1873, and the land along Copper Creek in the New Mexico Territory was the kind of beautiful that did not care whether you were alive to appreciate it. The cottonwoods had gone gold along the creek bank, and the red rock formations to the south caught the late morning light and burned like embers. Edwin had homesteaded this particular stretch of land for 4 years, and in that time he had spoken at length to very few people. His nearest neighbor, old Gus Mercer, had died the previous spring of a chest ailment that none of the remedies Edwin brought from the trading post at Fort Sumner had been able to touch. Edwin had helped bury him on the little ridge above the property line, and after that, the Mercer cabin had sat empty and darkening through the summer heat, the windows going dusty and the vegetable garden going to weeds and then to hard earth. Edwin was 31 years old. He had the kind of face that had been weathered fast, the skin around his eyes creased deeply in a way that would have belonged to an older man under different circumstances. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with hands that showed every year of the work he had put into this land, and brown hair that ran long enough now to brush his collar, because he could not always be bothered to ride the distance to the barber in the town of Cimarron. He kept the cabin clean enough. He kept the horses in good condition. He made sure the fences held and the roof did not leak, and the root cellar stayed stocked enough to see him through a hard winter, which in this part of the territory could arrive without much warning and stay without much mercy. What Edwin did not do was let himself feel settled. That was the honest truth of it, though he would not have said so to another person. He had tried to feel settled. He had tried to feel like this land was home in the way that home was supposed to feel, like something that held you gently from the inside, rather than something you simply occupied the way a stone occupies the bottom of a creek. He had come to New Mexico after the war. Most men who had survived the war between the states and found themselves walking through the aftermath had done one of several things. Some had gone home to what remained of home. Some had tried to rebuild where the rubble still sat. Some had gone west, because west was the direction a man went when east had become something he no longer recognized and could not bear to look at. Edwin had gone west. He had been 22 years old when he enlisted with the Union Army out of Ohio, and he had been 24 when the fighting ended at Appomattox, and he had spent the 2 years between those events in places that had done something to him that he could not fully articulate, but that he felt constantly. The way a man who has broken a bone badly will feel it in damp weather for the rest of his life. He had come home to Ohio after the surrender, and found that the house he had grown up in felt like a theater set rather than a place where people lived. His mother had wept with relief, and his father had shaken his hand, and his younger brother Thomas had looked at him with a combination of admiration and uncertainty that had made Edwin feel like a stranger to himself. He had stayed 6 months. He had then said his goodbyes and ridden southwest, and then further southwest, and eventually he had found Copper Creek and the 40 acres along it that the government was willing to grant to a veteran who was willing to prove it up. He had proved it up. He had built the cabin with his own hands and the occasional assistance of men passing through who were grateful for a meal and a dry place to sleep. He had dug the well. He had broken the garden ground. He had run cattle on the open range to the east and built a small herd that he sold each fall in Cimarron or sometimes as far as Trinidad across the Colorado border. He had made himself useful, and he had made himself a life that by any objective measure was a respectable and solid life. But he had not felt at home, not once, not in any of those 4 years. He thought about this sometimes, in the evenings when the work was done and the fire had burned down to coals, and the coyotes were calling to each other somewhere out in the dark. He would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he would try to locate the feeling he remembered from before the war, that particular quality of ease that a person feels when they are exactly where they belong and they know it without having to think about it. He remembered feeling it as a boy. He remembered it in the kitchen of his family's house, in the smell of his mother's bread, and the sound of rain on the roof, and the certainty that the world was a comprehensible and manageable place. He had not felt it since. He had come close in odd moments when the land around Copper Creek did something particularly stunning at dawn or dusk, but close was not the same as arriving, and he knew the difference. He watched the smoke from the Mercer cabin for a good 10 minutes that morning before he went back inside to finish his breakfast, and he thought, whoever it is, they have a lot of work ahead of them. He did not go down to investigate that day. It was not his business. Whoever had taken on the old Mercer place had presumably done so through the proper channels, either purchasing it from Mercer's distant relations or filing their own claim, and Edwin respected the kind of privacy that a man moving into unfamiliar territory generally needed. He knew how it felt to arrive somewhere new and have people show up with their curiosity wearing a thin disguise of neighborliness. He had been on the receiving end of that when he first settled here, and he had not loved it. He went about his work. He spent the morning mending fence along the southern pasture, where one of his steers had pushed through the previous week, and in the afternoon he cleaned out the chicken coop and made a mental list of what he would need to get from Cimarron before the month was out. He cooked his supper and ate it alone, looking at the far wall where he had hung a small watercolor his mother had sent him 2 years ago of an Ohio meadow in summer, and he was surprised to find himself wondering about the smoke from the cabin down the creek in a way that had nothing to do with the land or the fences or anything practical at all. He did not sleep especially well that night. 3 days passed before he saw her. He had ridden down to check the creek crossing, where the low-water ford sometimes silted up after the fall rains, and he came around the bend of cottonwoods at a walk, and pulled up short because there was a woman standing knee-deep in the shallows of Copper Creek, with her skirts hiked up and gathered in her fists and her hair coming loose from its pins in the afternoon wind, and she was wrestling with what appeared to be a water barrel that had gotten away from her, and was listing dangerously in the current. Edwin did not hesitate. He stepped down from his horse, tied the reins to the nearest branch, pulled off his boots because there was no time to think about it, and waded in. "Hold it on the upstream side," he said, reaching her in about 4 strides. "Do not fight the current, just turn it so it catches the bank." She looked at him with a pair of dark eyes that showed no particular fear and a good deal of determination, and she did exactly what he said. Together they wrestled the barrel to the near bank and shoved it up the gravel until it sat stable and no longer in danger of taking the next quarter-mile of creek at speed. Edwin stood up straight and pushed the wet hair out of his eyes and looked at her. She was somewhere in her late 20s, he guessed, with a face that was striking rather than pretty in the conventional sense, all strong lines and a wide, expressive mouth. She was lean in the way of someone who had worked hard and eaten regularly but not extravagantly, and she stood with a quality of self-possession that Edwin found immediately and unexpectedly affecting. Her dress was of faded blue cotton, practical and plain. The hem of it was soaked to the knee and beyond. She had a smear of creek mud along one forearm. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was lower than he had expected, measured and direct. "I had it almost handled." "You did," Edwin said. "I just helped with the last part." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not entirely read, and then she almost smiled. "Ida Wallace," she said. "Edwin Dalton, I have the place upstream." "I know," she said. "Gus Mercer mentioned you. He said you were quiet but decent." Edwin absorbed this. "Old Gus spoke of me." "Gus and I corresponded," she said. She had pushed a strand of dark hair back from her face and was looking at the barrel with the calm assessment of someone calculating the next problem. "He was my father's second cousin. When he died, he left the property to my father, and my father was too unwell to come, so I came instead." Edwin found himself wanting to ask a great many things at once. He settled on the most practical. "Did you come alone?" "I did," she said, with a tone that suggested she was aware of the weight of that statement and had already made her peace with it. "My brother was going to come with me, but he broke his leg 3 weeks before I left Missouri, and I could not wait any longer. The claim had to be occupied or it reverted." "Where in Missouri?" "Outside of Joplin," she said. "You are from Ohio, if I am remembering Gus correctly. He told you that." "He wrote lengthy letters," she said, and now she did smile briefly and fully, and it rearranged her face in a way that made Edwin's breath catch for just a second. He mentioned his neighbor up the creek who kept mostly to himself but always brought medicine when Gus was sick and never asked for anything in return. Edwin picked up his boots from the bank. "How long have you been at the cabin?" "4 days," she said. "I have been cleaning for 3 of them." "I do not think Gus was much for housekeeping toward the end." "He was not," Edwin agreed. "What do you need? I can bring tools or help with anything that is in poor repair." She looked at him steadily, and he had the sense that she was measuring him, not unkindly, but with a seriousness that he found he respected. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "The roof has a gap above the east window that will be a problem when the rain comes. I noticed the barn door is off its upper hinge, and the garden ground will need turning before spring if I am going to have anything to eat next year." "I can do the roof and the barn door this week," Edwin said. "The garden turning we can do together if you have a second spade." "I do not," she said, "but I will get one from Cimarron. I have 2. I will bring both." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she nodded the way a person nods when they have decided to trust something uncertain. "All right," she said. "That is kind." "It is neighborly," Edwin said. "There is a difference." She picked that up with a quick, assessing look, and he had the feeling she had registered it as a significant distinction, the same way he had meant it. He carried the water barrel up to the cabin for her, set it where she directed, and rode home in the late afternoon light feeling something unfamiliar moving slowly through him, something warm and tentative that he was almost afraid to examine directly. He came the following morning with his tools and a tin of roofing pitch he had been saving since the previous spring. Ida Wallace was already outside when he arrived, splitting wood with a practiced competence that he found himself watching with something embarrassingly close to admiration. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair pinned more firmly today, and she greeted him with a nod and offered him coffee before he went up on the roof, which he accepted. They drank it on the porch of the old Mercer cabin, and it was not quite comfortable yet, not the kind of comfortable that you can just sit inside without trying, but it was something. It was the beginning of something, though Edwin would not have been able to say so at that moment. She told him, as he worked the roof that morning, that she had been a school teacher in Joplin for 5 years. She called up through the gap when she had something to say, and he answered through the same gap when he had something to say back, and the conversation built itself slowly and unevenly, the way all worthwhile things do. She told him she had been married once briefly. She said it plainly, without fuss. Her husband had died in 1870, 3 years after the war ended, from a fever that took him in 2 weeks. They had been married less than a year. She said she had been 25 and had spent the 3 years since then teaching school and looking after her father and thinking about what kind of life she was actually going to build, as opposed to the kind she had assumed she would have. Edwin listened to this from the roof and felt the kind of recognition that cuts quickly and cleanly. He did not say so immediately. He was not practiced at saying such things. But he came down for his midday meal, which she had prepared with what he recognized as the resourcefulness of someone working with limited provisions, fried salt pork and cornbread and cold creek water, and he looked across the rough table at her and said, "I know something about the difference between the life you assumed and the one you end up making." She looked up from her plate and held his gaze. "You were in the war," she said. "It was not a question. Union Army. 2 years." She set her fork down, not in distress, but with the deliberateness of someone who understands that some things deserve that small ceremony of attention. "My husband was too young for the war," she said. But his older brothers went, and they came back changed in ways that frightened me sometimes. I never quite understood it until later, when I understood that a person cannot witness the things they witnessed and come out the other side with the same interior architecture they went in with. Edwin looked at her. Interior architecture, he said. I was always reading too much, she said. It drove my mother to distraction. He laughed. It was a short and surprised sound, not quite accustomed to the shape of itself, and she smiled at hearing it. "What kinds of things are you reading now?" he asked. "I brought 11 books from Joplin," she said. "I had to leave 23 behind, which very nearly broke my heart. Right now I am reading a George Eliot novel that I have already read twice, but which keeps revealing new things each time. What about you? Do you read?" "When I have something to read," he said. Old Gus had a Bible and 2 almanacs. There is a man in Cimarron who loans books out of his house informally. I have used that arrangement a few times. "Tell me what you have read." And so he did, and then she told him what she had read. And the afternoon moved around them without either of them noticing it particularly, until Edwin looked up and saw the sun dropping toward the red rock ridgeline to the west, and realized he had been sitting at this rough table for 2 hours longer than he had intended. He got up and said he would finish the barn door in the morning if she did not mind, and she said she did not mind, and he rode home in the early dusk with the cottonwoods going copper and gold around him, and that slow, warm thing moving in him a little more readily now, a little less afraid of itself. He came back the next morning and fixed the barn door. He brought both spades as he had promised, and they spent an afternoon turning the garden ground together, working at a companionable distance, occasionally calling observations back and forth about the soil quality and what she planned to plant come spring. She knew a good deal about gardening. She had kept her father's kitchen garden for years and had a clear-eyed and practical knowledge of what would and would not grow in what kind of ground. Edwin found himself deferring to her on several points and not minding it. He introduced her properly to the town of Cimarron on his next supply run, taking her along in his wagon and making the introductions that needed making. The town in 1873 was a rough and lively place, the headquarters of the Lucian Maxwell land grant operations, and there were more people passing through it at any given time than there were permanent residents. There was trouble sometimes, the kind that tended to follow contested land rights and strong whiskey and men who were carrying things they should have put down a long time ago. Edwin was known there as a steady man, the kind who paid his debts and did not start altercations, and the people he introduced Ida to received her with the combination of frank curiosity and cautious warmth that was typical of frontier towns toward women who arrived alone with serious eyes and no apparent need to explain themselves. She bought a sack of flour and a new hatchet and a length of oilcloth for the east window, and she bargained with the dry goods man in a way that Edwin could tell startled the man slightly, because she knew what things cost and said so plainly. On the way home in the wagon she was quiet for a stretch, watching the landscape, and then she said, "Cimarron is a rougher place than I expected." "The land grant troubles make it complicated," Edwin said. "There has been violence over who owns what. The Maxwell Land Grant Company claims land that settlers have been living on for years, and neither side is being entirely reasonable about it. It gets ugly sometimes." She absorbed this. "Is your land in dispute?" "No," he said. "I filed properly and I am far enough from the main contested areas, but men have been killed over it, and I do not want to minimize that." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Gus mentioned the troubles in his letters. He said he kept his head down and his rifle cleaned." "That is approximately the correct policy," Edwin said. She turned to look at him with an expression that was direct and unashamed and a little searching. "Are you a man who keeps his head down?" He thought about that honestly. "I try not to make trouble," he said, "but I will not walk away from something that is genuinely wrong. The war taught me that much, though it taught it in a very expensive way." She held his gaze for a moment and then turned back to the road ahead. "Good," she said simply. October moved forward. The mornings grew cold and the evenings grew longer, and Edwin found reasons, frequently, to be at the Mercer cabin, or at least not to avoid it. He told himself the first several times that he was simply being a responsible neighbor. Ida was alone, the property was in poor repair, and it was the decent thing to do. He brought over a section of chain for a gate hinge. He helped her stack the cord of wood she had traded 2 of Gus's remaining chickens for with a family down the road named Harmon. He looked at the wood stove and determined that the flue needed cleaning and cleaned it, which probably saved her from a chimney fire sometime in November. But there was more to it than that, and he knew it, and he suspected she knew it, and for a time they both maintained the comfortable fiction of practicality while something else grew steadily between them. The way grass grows up through the cracks of a stone path, persistent and quiet and impossible to fully discourage. They began to take their evening meals together some nights. This started when Edwin stayed later than intended, helping her rehang a shutter that kept coming loose in the evening wind, and she had supper ready and invited him in a matter-of-fact way that gave him an easy way to accept or decline without either option carrying the weight of significance. He accepted. After that, it became a pattern without anyone quite declaring it a pattern, which was perhaps the best way for it to happen. She was a good cook, better than he was, which was not a high bar in Edwin's case. He had kept himself alive and reasonably well-nourished for 4 years of solitary frontier living, but alive and well-nourished were the ceiling of his culinary ambitions. Ida made things that actually tasted like something beyond their ingredients, the way a skilled person can take the same notes as a poor musician and produce something that sounds entirely different. He told her so one evening, and she looked pleased in a way that she seemed to immediately decide was more than she intended to show, and then she showed it anyway. "My mother was an excellent cook," she said. "I had good instruction. She is still living." "She died in '68, Ida said. "Consumption. She had been ill for a long time." She said it with the quiet steadiness of someone who has grief that is old enough to have settled into its proper shape. She would have hated this, she added, and there was something almost amused in it. "The territory, I mean, the dust and the wind and the lack of civilization." She would have made a very thorough list of her objections and sent it to me in the post. "You would have read it and come anyway," Edwin said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I would have." He walked home that night in the cold dark with the stars tremendous overhead, the way they always were at this elevation and this remove from any city's light, and he did something he had not done in a very long time. He looked up at them and let himself feel something without immediately suppressing it. November came, and with it the first real cold, the kind that put frost on the grass in the mornings and made the horses blow white clouds in the air. Edwin brought Ida a second heavy blanket from his own stores, an extra one he had purchased in Trinidad the previous winter and never needed, because his cabin was warm and he did not feel the cold much. She took it without excessive protest, which he appreciated. He came in one evening to find her sitting at the table with a letter spread open in front of her, and an expression on her face that he recognized from looking in mirrors. The particular landscape of someone receiving difficult news, and in the process of deciding what to do with it. He came in quietly and put the pot of venison stew he had brought on the stove and said nothing, waiting to see if she wanted to speak. She folded the letter after a moment. "My father's health is worse," she said. "My brother writes that the doctor is not optimistic." Edwin sat down across from her. "I am sorry. He wants me to come home," she said. "My brother, I mean. He says the claim can wait, that they will find someone to look after it." She paused. "He does not understand what it means to prove up land, or perhaps he does and is hoping I do not." "Do you want to go?" Edwin asked. She was silent for a long moment. "I want my father to be well," she said. "I want a great many things that are not on offer. What I can choose is whether to stay and build the life I came here to build, or to go back to a life that was smaller than what I am capable of." She looked at him. "That sounds cold when I say it out loud." "It does not," Edwin said. "It sounds like someone who has been honest with herself." She looked at him for a long time in the lamplight. "Do you miss Ohio?" she asked. He thought about it genuinely. "I miss certain things about it," he said, "but Ohio is not where I want to be." "Is this where you want to be?" It was a question with layers, and they both knew it. Edwin met her gaze and felt the warmth in him that had been growing for weeks settle more solidly into something that he could not pretend was just neighborliness any longer. "Yes," he said, "more and more." She held his gaze for another few seconds and then looked at the folded letter. "I will write to my brother," she said. "I will tell him I am staying." She wrote the letter that night while he ate his stew across from her, and the lamplight was steady and golden, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek with a sound like water, and Edwin felt something he had not felt in so long that he almost could not name it. He almost felt at home. Not quite, but closer than he had been in a very long time, and getting closer by increments that frightened him a little, because he had learned through experience that the things you want most are the things that cost you most when they are gone, and he was still not entirely sure he was willing to pay that price again. He rode home that night and built up his own fire and sat in front of it for a while, the way he did when he was working something out. He thought about Ida Wallace and the steadiness of her, and the way she looked at difficult things directly, without flinching, without performing stoicism, but without collapsing under it either. He thought about the sound of her voice saying more and more, and the way she had held his gaze when she said she was staying. He did not sleep quickly, but he slept better than he had in a long time. In December, there was trouble. It began with 3 men who rode through the area in the first week of the month, men who bore the unmistakable quality of trouble, not outlaws exactly, but the kind of hired hands that wealthy men with contested interests used to make inconvenient settlers uncomfortable enough to leave. They were connected to the Maxwell Land Grant Company's ongoing campaign to pressure homesteaders off land the company claimed under the old Spanish grant, which conflicted with the government homestead claims that settlers like Edwin and now Ida held. Edwin learned about them from Harmon, the family down the road, who told him the 3 men had ridden over and suggested in polite but unmistakable terms that the Harmons might want to reconsider their residency. Edwin rode to Cimarron immediately, found the county sheriff, and said his piece. The sheriff was a man named Redfern who had the look of someone caught between large forces and not thriving in the position, but he was not corrupt and he listened. "I cannot make them leave the territory," Redfern said, "but I can let them know they are being watched and I can make sure the land office knows what is happening." "That is a start," Edwin said, "but I have a woman neighbor alone down the creek and I need to know if she is at risk." Redfern looked at him. "The Wallace claim." "Yes." "Her claim is solid," Redfern said. "Mercer's title was clean and the inheritance is documented. They would have a hard time making a case." "Legal soundness and actual safety are not always the same thing," Edwin said. Redfern acknowledged this with a nod that was heavy with the weight of everything he knew about the territory that he could not fix. "I will send a deputy around to make a visible presence," he said. "It is the best I can do." Edwin rode back that evening and stopped at Ida's cabin. He told her plainly and without dramatizing it what he had learned and what the sheriff had said. She listened with her arms folded across her chest, not in a defensive posture but in the way of someone bracing themselves to hear the full thing before responding. "Have they come here?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. 2 men rode past on the road this week slowly. They looked at the cabin for a long time. Edwin felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the December air. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I will not let anything happen to you or this property if it is in my power to prevent it. But you should also know that the best protection is probably documentation and legal standing, not a rifle." "I agree," she said. "I have copies of everything, the deed transfer, the inheritance papers, the county registration. I made duplicates before I left Joplin and I sent 1 set to my brother." He looked at her. That was smart thinking. "I had been warned that the territory was complicated," she said dryly. I prepared accordingly. They rode to Cimarron together the following morning, and she presented her documentation to the land office, and Edwin stood beside her while she did it, not speaking because she did not need him to speak, but present in a way that he hoped made something clear to anyone watching. Afterward, on the way home, she said, "You did not have to come." "I wanted to," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Edwin," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without any other words attached to it. Just his name, like she was testing the weight of it. "I am not a woman who needs saving." "I know that," he said. "I did not come to save you. I came because you are my neighbor and because the situation warranted company and because," he paused, "because I wanted to be there." The last part came out more plainly than he had intended, and she heard it. He could tell by the way she went still for just a moment before she looked ahead at the road again. "All right," she said softly. The three men did not come back. Whether it was the sheriff's visit, or the documentation, or simply the calculation that the Wallace claim was too legally solid to be worth the effort, Edwin never learned for certain. By the middle of December, the pressure had shifted elsewhere, toward other settlers in more ambiguous positions, and while Edwin's sympathy for those people was genuine and troubled him in the nights, the immediate danger to the properties along Copper Creek receded. Christmas came. In Cimarron, there was a celebration of sorts, a gathering at the church that had been built 2 years prior, with music and food contributed by the various families and single settlers who occupied the surrounding area. Edwin had not attended the previous year. He attended this year because Ida said she was going, and he found he wanted to go with her. She wore a green dress he had not seen before, something she had brought from Joplin and saved for the occasion. And when he arrived at her door to collect her in the wagon, she was putting on a coat, and she looked up at him with a directness that made his breath catch in the particular way that had been catching it with increasing frequency over the past months. "You look well," he said, which was deeply insufficient but was what came out of him. She looked at him with that almost amused expression she had. "Thank you, Edwin," she said. "So do you." He had in fact made an effort, wearing his good shirt and having ridden to the barber in Cimarron the day before, and he was grateful she had noticed without making more of it than the moment could gracefully hold. The gathering at the church was warm and crowded and smelled of pine and candle wax and the various foods that people had brought. Edwin knew most of the people there well enough to speak to, and Ida had in the months since her arrival cultivated a small number of acquaintances through her trips to town and through the Harmon family, who were gregarious and connected. A woman named June Harmon, Harmon's wife, took Ida by the arm almost immediately upon their arrival and drew her into a conversation with several other women, and Edwin found himself standing with Harmon and 2 other men talking about cattle prices and the question of whether the railroad coming through would help or harm the small ranching operations along the creek. He watched Ida across the room while he talked. He did it without being fully aware that he was doing it until Harmon said, without looking at him, "She is a remarkable woman, that one." And Edwin turned back to find Harmon watching him with a quiet, knowing expression. "She is," Edwin said. "You should tell her so," Harmon said, "before someone else does." Edwin looked at the man, who shrugged with the comfortable certainty of someone who had been married happily for 15 years and had arrived at a generous view of other people's romantic situations. After the gathering, driving home in the wagon under a cold, clear sky enormous with stars, Ida was quiet in the way she sometimes was, not withdrawn but thinking, settled into whatever was occupying her mind. Edwin drove and let the silence be what it was. The horses knew the road home. After a while she said, "I wrote to my father last week. A real letter, not just news. I told him about the land and the cabin and the creek and the mountains." She paused. "I told him I thought I was going to be all right here." "Are you?" Edwin asked. She turned to look at him. The cold air had put color in her cheeks and her dark eyes were bright in the starlight. "More than all right," she said quietly. "I think I am beginning to be happy, which surprises me given the circumstances." "Which circumstances?" "Being alone," she said, "far from home." in a place that is genuinely uncertain. None of those things are typically conducive to happiness. No, Edwin said, they are not. He was quiet for a moment. I have been alone here for 4 years, he said. And before the past few months, I would have told you that I had made my peace with it. And now, she said. He looked ahead at the road and then back at her, and he let himself feel the full weight of what had been building in him for months, that slow, warm, accumulating thing that he had been so careful with, that he had tried to ration and manage because he was afraid of it. He let himself feel it without flinching. Now I know the difference between making peace with something and being at peace, he said. They are not the same thing. She was very still beside him. The wagon moved slowly along the creek road, the water audible nearby, silver in the moonlight. No, she said. They are not. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of her cabin, and she did not immediately move to get down. They sat in the dark and the cold and the quiet of the creek for a moment that felt larger than its actual duration. Ida, he said. Edwin, she said. And then he leaned forward and took one of her hands in both of his, the way you hold something that matters, carefully and with attention, and she looked at their hands and then up at his face, and whatever she saw there was apparently sufficient because she did not look away. I do not know how to do this gracefully, he said. I have been out of practice with anything resembling this for a very long time. But I want you to know that these past few months have been the best I have had since before the war, and the reason for that is largely you. She was quiet for a moment. Her hand was warm in his in spite of the cold air. Edwin Dalton, she said, you have been the best part of this place since I arrived. I want you to know that. He looked at her. I do not want to be your neighbor, he said, or not only your neighbor. What do you want to be? She asked. There was nothing coy in it. It was a genuine question, asked with the directness that was characteristic of everything about her. More than that, he said. Whatever more than that means and however long it takes to get there. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she turned her hand inside his and held his hand back, squeezing it with a firmness that felt like a promise. All right, she said. Let us find out what more than that means. He walked her to her door that night, and she went in, and he stood on her porch for a moment in the cold and the dark and looked up at the stars and felt something settle in his chest with a solidity that was almost physical. He rode home along the creek in the moonlight, and the cottonwoods were bare now, skeletal and beautiful against the night sky, and the water moved below them with a constant and comforting sound, and Edwin Dalton felt, for the first time in many years, as though he was exactly where he belonged. January in the territory was hard that year. The cold came in with real seriousness and stayed, and the creek froze along its edges, and the horses grew their winter coats thick, and the work of simply maintaining life occupied most of the daylight hours. Edwin split wood. He kept the animals fed and watered. He made sure his root cellar and his larder were adequate, and he made sure Ida's were too, carrying supplies down the creek road with a regularity that she accepted with less protest than she might have in October, because by January they both knew what this was. They spent evenings together more often now. Sometimes at her cabin, sometimes at his, which was larger and had a better fireplace, and they would sit across from each other with the fire going and talk, or read, or sit in a companionable silence that Edwin had not known he was capable of, and that he found he wanted to protect and preserve as one of the best things he had. She read him passages from her George Eliot novel when she came to something that struck her, and he listened with the full attention of someone to whom such things were being given generously after a long famine. He told her about the war sometimes, in pieces, not the worst of it, but the parts he could carry in language without dropping them. She listened the way she did everything, fully and without hurry, asking questions that were thoughtful and never intrusive. She told him about her first marriage, about the warmth of it and the brevity of it, and the kind of grief that comes from losing something before you have fully understood what you have. He told her one evening, sitting by his fire with the wind outside making the territory sound larger and wilder than even it was, that he had thought for a long time that the war had taken something from him permanently, some capacity for ease or belonging or whatever the specific gravity was that held a person inside their own life. She looked at him from across the hearth. "And now," she said. He looked at the fire. He looked at her. "Now I think it was not that it was taken permanently," he said. "I think it was that I had not found the right place to put it back." She got up from her chair, crossed the small distance between them, and sat down beside him on the bench in front of the fire, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her beside him distinct from the warmth of the flames. She did not say anything. She simply sat with him in the firelight, and after a moment he put his arm around her, and she leaned in against his side, and they sat like that for a long time while the fire burned down and the wind talked outside. He kissed her for the first time that night, standing on the porch in the cold before she started the walk back down the creek road. He had offered the wagon, but she said the walk was short, and she liked the cold night air, and they stood for a moment in that suspended second before departure, and then he put his hand to her face carefully, and she looked up at him with those dark, steady eyes, and the kiss was brief and warm, and held a quality of arrival that made his chest ache with a feeling that was very nearly unbearable and very much the best thing he had felt in a decade. She walked home in the cold, and he watched her lantern move along the creek road until it was inside and the light was behind her window, and then he went in and sat for a long time by his dying fire without feeling the need to put any of it into words. February came and went. The winter held, but they held alongside it. He proposed to her in March. It was not a grand occasion. They had been working in her barn, repairing the partition between the two stalls with wood he had brought from his own stores, and she was handing him nails, and they were talking about the spring planting and what varieties of vegetables were most likely to thrive in the soil along the creek. And somewhere in the middle of that practical conversation, Edwin set down his hammer and turned to look at her and said, "Ida, I want to marry you." She held the nail she had been about to hand him and looked at him with an expression that was a combination of things he had come to know well: the seriousness and the brightness and the quality of total attention. "This is not how most men ask," she said. "I am not most men," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Her dark hair had pieces of sawdust in it from the work, and there was a smear of grease on her wrist from the barn door, and she was the most beautiful thing he had seen in the whole long span of his adult life. "Edwin Dalton," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He took the nail from her hand and set it down, and he took her face between his palms with great care, and he kissed her in the cold barn with the horses moving quietly in their stalls and the smell of hay and wood around them. And she kissed him back with an earnestness and a warmth that made the whole preceding winter feel like a journey to a destination he had not been sure existed. They were married in April in Cimarron at the small church that was not always peaceful in the surrounding landscape, but was, on that particular Saturday afternoon, exactly what it was supposed to be. June Harmon and her husband stood with them. The Redferns came. A dozen or so people from around the creek area came, because Edwin had been there for 4 years and Ida had in 6 months made the kind of impression that brought people out on a spring afternoon to witness something good. The preacher was a young man named Albright who had been assigned to the territory from an eastern diocese, and who was still visibly surprised by the landscape every morning, but who married them with genuine warmth and a sincerity that Edwin appreciated. He put the ring on Ida's finger, a simple silver band he had ordered from the jeweler in Cimarron, and she looked down at it and then up at him with bright eyes and said, "There," in a tone of satisfaction that made several people in the church smile. They went home to the larger of the 2 cabins, which was Edwin's, though they had spent the previous 2 weeks making it more fully a home for 2 people than it had been for one, moving books from the Mercer place and adding Ida's belongings and rearranging things until it felt, as Ida put it, like somewhere 2 people actually lived rather than somewhere one person was waiting out the time. The first night of their married life they sat on the porch of the cabin in the April evening, and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods were just beginning to show their first delicate green, and the sky above the red rock ridges was the kind of deep orange and gold that made even experienced witnesses of it stop and look. "This is a beautiful place," Ida said. "I know," Edwin said. "I did not always let myself think so." She looked at him sideways. "You do now." "I do now," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they watched the sun finish going down behind the mountains, and the creek talked on below them, and the first stars appeared above the eastern ridgeline. And Edwin Dalton held his wife, and felt the thing he had been looking for all the long years since the war settled finally and completely into the bones of him. A sense of home so total and uncomplicated that it almost frightened him, except that it did not. Because Ida was next to him, and that made the fear navigable. They grew into their life together with the practicality of people who understood that love was not sufficient on its own and had to be built alongside everything else. The garden that spring was their first true project as a partnership, and it was a revelation to Edwin, who had always kept a minimal kitchen garden that produced adequately without ever producing abundantly. Ida applied her knowledge and her attention to it, and by June the rows were thriving in a way that made the prospect of winter seem considerably less grim than it had in previous years. She taught a few of the children from neighboring homesteads to read informally, because there was no school within practical distance, and the need was genuine. She did this on 2 afternoons a week, clearing the large table in the cabin and having 4 or 5 children sit around it with slates and primers she had brought from Joplin. Edwin watched her do this and felt a quality of admiration that was not reducible to love alone, though love was present in it. She was good at this, naturally and skillfully good, with a patience that was not passive but active, a patience that engaged and challenged and made children feel both safe and capable. In June, Ida received word that her father had died. It came in a letter from her brother, a plain factual letter that nonetheless clearly cost him something to write, and she read it at the kitchen table while Edwin stood by the stove. And when she was done, she folded it carefully and set it on the table and then sat very still for a moment. Edwin crossed to her and sat beside her and took her hand, and she turned to him and pressed her forehead against his shoulder, and he held her while she cried, not enormously but thoroughly, the kind of weeping that is acknowledgement and release and grief all at once, the kind that a person needs to do in order to carry something properly. After a while she was quiet and she sat up and looked at him with red eyes that were also clear eyes, the kind that have looked at something painful without blinking. "He knew I was happy here," she said. "I told him in my last letter. I am glad he knew." "He knew," Edwin said. She squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she said, "for being here." "Where else would I be?" he said, and meant it absolutely. She wrote to her brother and invited him to visit when his leg was fully healed and when the time was right, telling him about the land and the cabin and the life they were building, describing it with the same clear-eyed warmth that she brought to everything she wrote, because Ida Wallace, who was now Ida Dalton, was a woman who wrote exactly what she meant and meant everything she wrote. Summer was long and hot and full. Edwin sold his cattle in July, a good sale, better than the previous year, and they put the money towards several improvements that had been waiting: a new well cover, proper glass in all the windows, materials for a second room on the cabin that they were going to need, though Ida had not yet officially said so. She told him in August, on an evening when they had been sitting on the porch after supper watching a thunderstorm move in from the west with the tremendous theatrical display that territory storms put on, the lightning walking on 3 legs across the red rock horizon, the thunder arriving in rolling long waves. She told him plainly, as she told him everything, and watched his face. Edwin looked at her and felt something crack open in his chest in the best possible way, the way the first green appears through snow, unexpected and unmistakable. He pulled her against him and held her very carefully, the way you hold something that has suddenly and irrevocably become the most important thing you have ever held. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. Stop looking at me like I am made of paper. I am sturdier than I look." "I know that," he said, laughing a little, his voice rough with feeling. "I know exactly how sturdy you are." She looked at him with shining eyes and a smile that was full and unguarded in a way that she did not always allow herself, and he kissed her while the thunderstorm approached, and the lightning moved closer, and the rain began to smell in the hot air before it arrived. They built the second room through September and October. Edwin did most of the structural work, but Ida was beside him for much of it, handing timber and driving nails and contributing opinions about the dimensions with a confidence that he had long since learned to simply trust, because she was consistently right. Harmon's older son came to help for a week in exchange for Edwin's assistance with a roof repair at the Harmon place, and the work went quickly. And by the end of October, there was a second room of solid construction attached to the original cabin, warm and clean and smelling of new lumber. The winter of 1874 was milder than the previous one, which felt like the territory's way of expressing something like goodwill. They spent the long evenings reading and talking and planning, the way people plan who have a future that they believe in. Ida's brother wrote in November to say he would come in the spring if the travel was manageable, and she read the letter to Edwin over supper, and he said he was looking forward to meeting the man, and meant it. In February, she began to show, and in March she was undeniable and magnificent, moving through the cabin with the dignity and slightly exasperated humor of a woman who had expected to remain nimble and was making the adjustment. Edwin was attentive without being smothering, which was a distinction he had worked to find, because he understood her need for her own competence and her own authority, and he was not going to undermine it simply because he loved her and was worried. He asked each morning how she felt and accepted the answer, whatever it was, without supplementing it with his own anxiety. They wrote for the doctor from Cimarron to be available from April onward, and he came when the time came in late April, a no-nonsense man named Whitmore who had delivered half the babies in the county and who treated Ida with a respect that Edwin appreciated. Their son was born on an afternoon in late April when the cottonwoods were in their first full leaf, and the creek was running clear, and the air smelled of everything new. He came into the world with the vigorous objection of someone who had opinions from the first moment, and he was solid and healthy and had his mother's dark eyes. They named him Thomas, for Edwin's younger brother, who was still living in Ohio and who Edwin wrote to the same day, a letter longer than any he had written since the war, telling Thomas about this boy and this woman and this life along Copper Creek that had become, against all the reasonable predictions of his experience, the truest home he had ever known. Edwin held his son that first evening while Ida slept, exhausted and peaceful and still impossibly beautiful, and he stood by the window with the baby against his chest and looked out at the creek below the cottonwoods in the April evening, and felt something that he had no fully adequate language for, but which was the completion of a long journey, the arrival at the place that he had not known he was going, but that he had apparently been going toward for everything that had come before. The war and the years of wandering, and the 4 empty years on the homestead, and the morning he had seen smoke from the Mercer cabin, and stood very still on his porch and felt something shift. He had thought he was making a life. He had been, without knowing it, making room. Thomas proved to be the sort of baby who made his opinions known with great enthusiasm, and who slept in unpredictable intervals that bore no relationship to the conventions of day and night. And Edwin and Ida navigated the months of new parenthood with the combination of exhaustion and elation that is apparently universal to people who have made something they love and cannot quite believe is real. Ida recovered her full strength by June, which she announced by going out to the garden and spending an entire morning in it without being asked, and by the resumption of her teaching afternoons, which the neighboring children had apparently missed considerably, if the speed of their reappearance was any indication. She brought Thomas with her on these afternoons, and the children, who ranged in age from 5 to 12, viewed him with a combination of curiosity and proprietary affection that made Ida laugh. Edwin's brother Thomas, for whom the baby was named, arrived in July. He came on the stage to Cimarron, and Edwin drove the wagon to meet him, and the two brothers stood in the dusty street of Cimarron and shook hands, and then embraced in the awkward, earnest way of men who are very glad to see each other, and are not quite practiced at showing it. Thomas was 27, younger and somewhat lighter in his manner than Edwin, with the same brown hair and a face that had not yet accumulated the same number of weathers. He had a wife back in Ohio, named Marion, who had sent along a package of preserved foods and a letter that Ida read at the kitchen table, and announced made her like Marion considerably. Thomas stayed for 3 weeks, and in that time he helped with the fence repairs that always accumulated over summer, learned to ride decently on Edwin's second horse, was taught by Ida to make a proper cornbread in the Dutch oven, and fell into a visible admiration of his brother's life that he expressed in the straightforward way of younger brothers by saying one evening at supper, "Ed, I did not entirely understand what you were doing out here until now." "What am I doing?" Edwin said. Thomas looked around the cabin, at Ida nursing the baby in the chair by the window, at the books on the shelf, at the view through the glass of the creek and the cottonwoods and the red rock ridges in the evening light. "Living," he said, "actually living." Edwin looked at Ida across the room. She was looking at him too, over the baby's head with that steady dark gaze, and she smiled, the full unguarded smile that was one of the most privately treasured things he owned. "Yes," Edwin said, "I am." Thomas left at the end of July with a promise to come back, and a message from both of them to Marion that they hoped she and Thomas would come together next time. It felt, after he had gone, like the cabin had been reminded of itself, reminded of all the life that was in it, and both Edwin and Ida moved through the following days with a heightened awareness of their luck that was the best kind of accounting. The fall of 1874 brought a good cattle sale and a fine harvest from the garden, better than even Ida had expected, and they put up jars and jars of preserved vegetables and fruits that lined the shelves of the root cellar in a way that made Edwin feel, every time he went down there, a physical and immediate sense of security that he had not possessed for a very long time. Young Thomas grew at the rate that babies grow, which is to say rapidly and with great purpose, and by his first birthday he was pulling himself upright against every piece of furniture in the cabin and examining the world from this new altitude with intense interest. He had Edwin's determination and Ida's sharpness, and a combination of the two that was already suggesting a personality quite his own. Christmas 1874 was different from the previous year in every way. They hosted at the cabin, which could now accommodate it with the additional room, and the Harmons came and brought their 3 children and a pot of something wonderful, and the Redferns came, and 2 other families from along the creek road, and there was music because Harmon's wife played the fiddle, and she brought it and played while the children sang imperfectly, and the adults sang imperfectly alongside them. And the cabin was full of firelight and voices, and the smell of Ida's cooking, and the baby asleep in his cradle in the back room. Edwin stood in the doorway between the main room and the new room at one point in the evening, and watched his wife moving through their home with the ease of someone who is exactly where they belong, and the quality of that moment, the sound and warmth and light of it, settled into him so completely that he felt it not just emotionally but physically, in his chest, in his hands, in the soles of his feet on the wooden floor he had laid himself. He had not felt at home anywhere since before the war. He felt it now with such completeness that it was almost overwhelming. He stood in his doorway and breathed it in slowly and let himself have it, all of it, without holding anything in reserve. Ida looked up from across the room and found his eyes, and she crossed to him, carrying a cup of something warm, and stood beside him in the doorway, and she followed his gaze around the room full of neighbors and children and firelight. "Edwin," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "I know," he said. She put her hand in his. "Merry Christmas," she said. "Merry Christmas, Ida." She leaned up and kissed him on the cheek and then stayed close beside him, and they stood together in the doorway of their home, while everyone else made noise and warmth around them. The years that followed were the years of building. They built incrementally and with purpose, each season adding to what the one before had established. The cattle herd grew steadily, and Edwin developed a reputation in the region for the quality of his animals, which commanded better prices in Cimarron and Trinidad. The garden got larger each spring, and Ida expanded her informal teaching operation into something more organized when, in the spring of 1876, a committee of neighboring families asked her formally to be the area's first teacher and agreed to contribute a small salary from a common fund. She accepted without hesitation, and they converted the old Mercer cabin, which had sat empty since the wedding except for storage, into a schoolroom. Edwin helped with the conversion, as he had helped with everything, and the day Ida walked into the cleaned and furnished former cabin to receive her first class of 11 children, Edwin stood in the doorway and watched her begin, and the feeling it gave him was one of the finest he had known, that particular pleasure of seeing someone be entirely themselves in exactly the right place. Thomas Dalton, their son, was a determined and curious child who could be found in any given moment either attempting to help his father with something well beyond his current ability or sitting beside his mother during her reading hours, with a look of concentration that was almost comic in someone so small. By the time he was 3, he had a stubborn sweetness that delighted everyone who knew him and exhausted his parents intermittently, which was as it should be. In the spring of 1877, Ida told Edwin she was expecting again, with the same plainness with which she had told him the first time. He responded with somewhat less surprise and somewhat more practical capability, having been through it once, but with the same swell of feeling that he suspected he would always have no matter how many times it happened. Their second child was born in November of 1877. It was another boy, whom they named James after Ida's father, and who arrived in the world with a temperament opposite to his brother's, quiet and observant, studying his surroundings from his first waking hours with an expression of profound assessment. He was healthy and beautiful, and Thomas, now 3 years old, greeted his brother's arrival with a combination of lordly approval and immediate possessiveness that made Edwin and Ida exchange a look over his head that contained a considerable amount of carefully suppressed laughter. Winter evenings with 2 small boys were differently arranged than they had been with one, and differently still from the years before children, and Edwin sometimes sat in the firelit cabin when both boys were finally asleep, and everything was quiet, and found himself marveling at how thoroughly and irrevocably his interior landscape had changed. He had come to this land as a man who had cauterized himself against belonging anywhere, who had built a functional life on the principle of sufficient rather than full, who had told himself that the absence of home feeling was something he had accepted and moved past. He had been lying to himself, lovingly and with good intentions, but lying nonetheless. Ida was at the table, writing in her journal by lamplight, her dark hair loosely pinned after the long day, her profile absorbed and beautiful in the warm light, and Thomas, the elder, had kicked off his blanket in his sleep and Edwin had gone in to replace it, and on the way back he stopped in the doorway between the rooms and just looked at her. She felt his gaze and looked up. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She looked at him steadily, and with knowledge, the way she always looked at him, seeing through the insufficient words to whatever was actually underneath them. She held his gaze for a moment and then smiled, slowly and fully, the smile that he had watched emerge that first day at the creek with the barrel, tentative and then complete. "Come sit with me," she said. He crossed the room and sat beside her at the table, and she closed her journal and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the fire burned quietly, and the creek moved outside in the dark, and from the back room the small sounds of 2 sleeping boys were the best music Edwin had ever heard. He thought of the morning he had seen the smoke from the Mercer cabin. He thought of the cold creek water and the water barrel listing in the current. He thought of coffee on a porch in October, and roof repairs, and evenings by the fire when they were still becoming, and Christmas night on the wagon in the starlight, and all of it moving toward this moment with a kind of inevitability that he had not recognized at the time, but that seemed, looking back, absolutely clear. "Ida," he said. She said, not moving, "I want to tell you something." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him with the open attention she always gave. "Before you came," he said, "I had been here 4 years and I had not let myself feel settled. I told myself I had accepted it. I had not. I was just managing." He looked at her. "You moved into that cabin down the creek and everything began to change, and I did not understand what was happening until it was already well underway. And now I am home, in every sense that word has ever meant. I am home." Ida held his gaze for a long moment, and something moved across her face that was too complete and too private to be entirely described. A combination of gratitude and recognition and love in its fullest and most particular form. The love that does not generalize but knows exactly and specifically who it is for and why. "I know," she said softly. "Me too." She took his hand across the table and he held hers, and the lamplight moved gently around them. And outside the New Mexico territory went about its dark and enormous night, indifferent and magnificent. And inside the cabin on Copper Creek, Edwin and Ida Dalton were exactly where they had each been going without knowing it, and they had arrived, and they were home. The spring of 1878 brought fresh soil and fresh prospects. Edwin expanded the herd in a careful way, purchasing 6 good stock cattle from a man named Bauer, who was relocating his family to the Arizona territory, and needed to reduce his animals before the journey. The addition of these cattle meant an additional section of fence to maintain, and Edwin found himself hiring a young man from Cimarron named Pete Carroll on a part-time basis, a good-natured and hard-working 20-year-old who had come west from Illinois looking for work, and who proved his worth inside the first week. Thomas, at nearly 4, followed Pete with the dedicated interest of a child who has identified a new and interesting category of person, asking questions in a continuous stream that Pete answered with remarkable patience. And Ida watched this from the kitchen window one morning and said to Edwin, "Your son is going to be an excellent rancher or an intolerable pest, and I cannot currently determine which." "Why not both?" Edwin said. She laughed, and it was the laugh he had loved from the first time he heard it, short and genuine and unperformed. That summer, Ida's brother came. His name was Daniel Wallace, and he came with his wife Clara, a capable and cheerful woman from Missouri who took one look at the New Mexico landscape from the stage in Cimarron and said, according to Daniel's account of it, "Well, it is certainly a place." They stayed for a month, and it was a month of good food and good talk and the particular pleasure of family visitors who genuinely like each other and want to know each other's lives. Daniel looked at what Edwin and Ida had built and said, plainly and without embellishment, "I was not sure you would manage this," and then added, "I was wrong." Edwin said, "Your sister managed it. I helped." Daniel looked at him and then at Ida, who was across the yard with Clara and little James on her hip, and he said, "Yes, that sounds right." In the evenings that summer there were often people on the porch, neighbors and visitors, and sometimes Pete, who had a good singing voice and no self-consciousness about using it, and the evenings were warm and the creek was low and running clear, and the smell of the land in summer was mesquite and dry grass and the faint mineral coolness from the mountains to the north. Edwin sat on the porch in those evenings with his wife beside him and his boys nearby and his neighbors around him, and felt the home feeling not as a relief or an absence of pain, but as a positive and specific thing, a warmth that had its own texture and its own gravity, the kind that holds a person in place not by force but by genuine want. There was one evening late in the summer of 1878, when Edwin was sitting alone on the porch after everyone had gone in. Pete had ridden back to town, and the boys were in bed, and Ida was finishing the last few pages of a novel she had been reading for 2 weeks. The sky had gone from its extravagant sunset to its equally extravagant night, and the stars over Copper Creek were the kind of stars that a person with a certain kind of history looks at and feels the full improbability of still being under them. Edwin sat with his coffee and thought about the 10 years since the war. He thought about the boys he had served alongside, the ones who had not come home, the ones who had come home and not recovered, the ones who had come home and made their peace or failed to. He thought about what it cost to survive something. He thought about the years of managing and being sufficient and telling himself it was enough. He thought about smoke rising from the Mercer cabin on an October morning, and a feeling he could not immediately name. He looked out at the creek, dark and moving in the starlight, and at the cottonwoods now black against the sky, and at the cabin behind him with its window glowing gold and Ida inside moving through the light. He had not wasted the years he had spent in the long solitary quiet. He had needed them, he thought. He had needed to be still long enough to be ready, to let the war settle in him to the point where it was not everything, just part of the whole. He had needed 4 years of watching the seasons on this land before he could see another person clearly enough to love them truly. He had needed to understand what he was building before he could understand why. But he was glad, more than he had words for, that the smoke had risen from the Mercer cabin that morning. He was glad he had gone to the creek ford to check the silting. He was glad for the water barrel in the current and a woman who had it almost handled, and who looked at him with dark, steady eyes, and said her name with a directness that was, though he did not know it at the time, already the most significant introduction of his life. The door of the cabin opened behind him and Ida came out, finished with her novel, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the night air. She sat in the chair beside him and looked out at the stars with the same quiet attention she brought to everything worth looking at. "Good ending?" he asked. "The best kind," she said. "The kind where everything is genuinely resolved and nobody has to pretend it was not difficult to get there." He looked at her. "That is also my preferred kind." She turned to meet his gaze, and in the starlight she was exactly as she had been on the creek bank in October of 1873, direct and clear-eyed and entirely herself. "Edwin Dalton," she said. "We have done well." He reached over and took her hand. "We have," he said. They sat together in the dark and warm night while the creek talked below them and the stars moved overhead in their long, slow paths, and the territory went about its ancient and indifferent business all around them. But on this porch in this moment there was nothing indifferent at all. There was only the specific and irreplaceable warmth of a man and a woman who had each come through hard country and found each other at the end of it, and who had built, stone by stone and season by season, something that deserved the word that Edwin had not been able to apply to anything for a very long time. Home. Exactly, irrevocably, completely home.